So if you see a child screaming in a grocery store, like thrashing on the floor, your brain probably makes this immediate automatic assumption.
Right,
Oh,
totally. You automatically think, well, they want a candy bar.
exactly. They were told no, and now they're just making everyone in the aisle pay for it.
Yeah, that's the default human reaction.
It is, but biologically speaking, you might actually be looking at an autonomic nervous system that is fighting for its actual life.
Yes, which is a completely different universe than just wanting candy.
Exactly. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking a massive stack of sources today. We've got clinical neurology from the Autism Research Institute, the lived experiences mapped out by Reframing Autism.
And we also have those practical tools from educator Sue Larkey.
Right, and the unapologetically raw reality of the Autism Dad blog. We're using all of this to decode these explosive behaviors. Our mission for you, the listener, is to learn how to distinguish between a behavioral tantrum and a true autonomic storm.
Which is often called an autistic meltdown.
Right, because while they might look completely identical to an outside observer, understanding the biological difference, it fundamentally changes how we step in as allies and caregivers.
And that visual identicality is exactly what makes this so incredibly difficult to navigate in real time.
Because they look the same.
They really do. To the naked eye, the outward manifestation, the crying, the lashing out, the complete disruption of the environment, it's the exact same.
Yeah.
But if we want to actually help, we have to look past that surface behavior. We have to understand the internal neurological reality driving it.
Okay, so let's set a quick baseline. Since you're likely already familiar with the basics of behavioral conditioning, we don't need to spend much time on the classic temper tantrum. We know what it is.
Right, we've all seen one.
Right. A tantrum is a learned behavioral response.
Right.
According to the sources, it's basically a rough, highly unpleasant negotiation tactic.
A very loud negotiation tactic.
Exactly. A child wants a toy or, they want to avoid doing their math homework, so they use an outburst to express frustration.
They're trying to force the adult into a desired outcome.
Right, so both parties are essentially at the negotiating table, even if one is screaming.
Because it is purposeful. During a tantrum, the individual is maintaining a continuous level of control over their body and their mind.
They're choosing it.
Yes,
Right.
they are choosing this behavior as a specific tactic to manipulate an environment. And I think the absolute key identifier of a tantrum is that it requires an audience.
Oh, that's such a good point.
Yeah, if you walk away, the child usually stops.
Mm-hmm.
Because the tactic is totally useless if no one is watching the performance.
Right, but then we pivot to the meltdown, which clinical literature often refers to as an autonomic storm. And honestly, that phrase alone completely shifts the perspective.
It really does.
Because you don't negotiate with a storm.
You don't. You
Yeah.
can't. A meltdown is an involuntary, completely uncontrollable reaction to an overwhelmed nervous system.
So there's no goal.
None at all. There is no manipulative intent, no desired outcome that they're seeking. And unlike the tantrum, an autonomic storm will happen, even if the individual is completely alone in an empty room.
Wow. Okay.
The behavior just isn't a tactic.
Yeah.
It is the catastrophic failure of the nervous system's ability to process input.
But wait, I want to push back on this a little because put yourself back in that grocery store aisle. It is so easy for us to sit here, removed from the chaos and intellectually separate a tantrum from a meltdown.
Oh, absolutely. In theory, it's simple.
Right. But when you are in the thick of it, the noise is deafening, people are staring at you. How do we actually separate the biology from the environment in that moment?
Well, it requires overriding our own human nature, honestly.
What do you mean?
So neurotypical brains are heavily wired to look for cause and effect. We automatically assume that any extreme behavior equals the communication of a want.
Right, like they're screaming so they must want something.
Exactly. To break that assumption, we have to look at the underlying biology of an autistic or neurodivergent brain. We have to look at how sensory data is actually processed.
And this is where the clinical data from the Autism Research Institute really illuminates the issue. We're talking about neurons exhibiting a much higher level of connectivity compared to non-autistic people.
Meaning the sensory systems are taking in significantly more data at any given millisecond.
Okay, so walk us through that.
So let's look at the brain's physical hierarchy. You have the brain stem, which is the oldest part of the brain. It's responsible for our most primal survival instincts.
Breathing, heart rate, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. The fight, flight, or freeze response. Then you have the limbic system, which processes complex emotions, and the prefrontal cortex, which handles logic, reasoning, and impulse control.
So what happens when this highly connected brain walks into a chaotic environment like a crowded grocery store?
Well, the brain is suddenly receiving this massive wave of sensory input. You've got fluorescent lights flickering, 50 different conversations happening at once.
Yeah. The hum of the refrigerators.
Yeah, the smell of the deli counter. Because of that hyperconnectivity we talked about, the brain receives more input than it can effectively filter.
It's just too much data.
Way too much. The amygdala, which acts as the brain's internal smoke detector, becomes hyper-aroused. It doesn't just register this as an annoyance, it signals a catastrophic threat.
Wow. So it interprets the sensory overload as a literal physical threat to life.
Yes. And the brainstem literally hijacks the entire system to ensure survival. When that happens, blood flow and electrical activity physically shift away from the prefrontal cortex.
So the logic center goes completely offline.
Completely. The person is no longer capable of analytical thinking or emotional regulation. They are trapped in pure, unadulterated survival mode.
That neurological mechanism makes so much sense when you look at the triggers Sularki outlines in her educational guides, because to a neurotypical person, the triggers seem completely innocuous.
They seem like nothing.
Yeah, we are talking about school bells, or the sudden blast of a hand dryer in a public restroom, the physical texture of a specific shirt collar.
Or even just a sudden change in a daily schedule.
Right. To you or me, an annoying sound is just annoying. But to a highly connected neurodivergent brain, it is a biological attack.
And it's important to note it can also be internal. Cognitive overload is a massive trigger.
Like what? Like too much information?
Yeah, like being given complex multi-step verbal instructions before the brain has finished processing the first step. Or it can be uncommunicated physical pain or digestive discomfort. The processing limit is simply reached and breached.
You know, here's where it gets really interesting to me. I want to dig into how neurotypical brains avoid this because it highlights the fundamental difference. There is a concept called sensory gating, right?
Yes, the idea of habituation.
Yeah. So if I sit in a room with a loudly humming air conditioner, my brain notices it for the first 5 minutes and then it essentially filters it out. It decides the sound isn't a threat, so it stops bringing it to my conscious attention.
Habituation is a vital survival mechanism for neurotypical brains. It prevents overload.
But the sources indicate that artistic brains don't necessarily habituate to background stimuli in the same way.
They don't.
So if they hear that humming air conditioner, their brain might perceive it at the exact same intense volume hour after hour.
Yes, exactly.
So it's not just a single event causing the storm. It's a cumulative effect. It's basically like a cup of water constantly being filled, drop by agonizing drop, until it violently overflows.
That's a great analogy. The distress remains at a high plateau. The cup is constantly filling. And this highlights why trying to apply logic, reason, or standard discipline during an autonomic storm is entirely futile.
Because they can't hear you.
Right. You cannot reason with a brainstem that believes it is currently being chased by a predator. Giving a verbal command to someone who is mid-meltdown, like telling them to calm down or look at me.
You're just adding more water to an already overflowing cup.
Exactly. The auditory processing required to understand your command is just more sensory data their brain cannot handle.
Okay, so if the cup is constantly filling throughout the day, how do you, as an ally or caregiver, spot the water rising before the spill? Because once the logic center goes offline, you're just doing damage control, right?
Yeah, you are. But Sue Larkey's materials map this out incredibly well. She outlines 3 distinct phases of a behavioral meltdown.
Okay, what are they?
The buildup, which is often called the rumbling phase. Then the survival phase, which is the storm itself, and the recovery phase.
Yeah.
The rumbling phase is your critical intervention window.
The warning signs.
Exactly.
And these can be subtle if you aren't paying close attention, right? I mean, it might be an increase in pacing, sudden fidgeting, subtly covering the ears, an uptick in repetitive movements, or, what I found most interesting, a sudden verbal withdrawal.
Yeah, they just go completely silent.
Right.
The verbal withdrawal is often a sign that the brain is diverting energy away from language processing to try and manage the sensory assault. If you can spot this rumbling, you can intervene by drastically reducing the sensory input before the brainstem fully takes over.
Let's put this into a concrete context for the listener. The Reframing Autism Guide uses this brilliant comparison of 2 scenarios in a toy store.
I love this example.
It's so clear. So, scenario 1. A child points to a toy. The parent says no. The child has learned that if they scream and make a massive, embarrassing public scene, the parent will cave just to stop the stares.
Which is a tantrum.
Exactly. It's calculated, it's a negotiation, and as soon as the toy is handed over, the tears dry up.
Instantly. Now compare that to the second scenario.
Right. Same toy store, same child. But this time, the child is feeling physically dizzy from the harsh fluorescent lights bouncing off the shiny floors. They are being assaulted by the chaotic, loud, beeping sounds of battery-operated toys going off everywhere.
Just too much input.
Yes. And the parent actually tries to offer them a toy to distract them, but the sensory assault continues. The child becomes completely dysregulated. They begin involuntarily flapping their hands, crying in a panicked, breathless way, and completely lose their ability to speak.
That is a meltdown.
There is no manipulation. It's pure distress. The child isn't looking at the parent for a reaction. They are just trying to survive the environment.
And that lack of environmental awareness is the key indicator there.
Right.
But, we have to acknowledge the reality of the caregiver in these moments.
Oh, absolutely.
Maintaining the clinical objectivity to spot that difference is incredibly difficult when you're exhausted.
We absolutely cannot just talk about clinical perfection here. I was reading a raw post from the Autism Dad blog, and he brings up a reality that completely shatters this clinical detachment.
It's a very powerful post.
It really is. He describes an incredibly stressful morning with his son. His son had been repeatedly lying about a simple sketchbook homework assignment. When the dad finally caught him in the lie and revoked his tablet privileges for the weekend, the son threw an absolute earth-shattering fit.
Screaming, crying, throwing things.
Massive drama.
And he explicitly identifies it as a tantrum, despite the intensity.
He does. And I mean, he is running on fumes. He is terrified for his son's very fragile medical health. But he notes a crucial granular detail. His son was able to start and stop the crying on demand.
There it is, the start-stop.
Yes. It was a willful, dramatic performance designed to manipulate the situation, make the dad feel guilty, and avoid the consequences of the lie. The dad wrote something to the effect of, "Please don't tell me he just needs a hug. This is a tantrum, pure and simple."
Wow.
So how does a parent in that situation, a parent who is experiencing deep caregiver fatigue, keep their own sanity and accurately assess the situation in real time?
Well, caregiver burnout compromises the adult's prefrontal cortex as well.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, when you are chronically stressed, you are highly reactive. The most critical tool in the wild is observing that exact start-stop control the dad mentioned. Is the individual checking to see if you are watching?
Right. Are they looking for an audience?
Exactly. Do they pause their screaming to catch their breath, check your reaction, and then resume the volume? If that level of executive function is present, you are likely dealing with willful behavior.
Because the logic center is still active.
Right. But if they are completely lost in the storm, unaware of their surroundings, perhaps even accidentally injuring themselves because they have lost spatial awareness, that is an autonomic event.
Okay, so let's say you've made the assessment. The fuse is blown. It is a genuine meltdown. What do you do? The sources we are looking at outline a very specific three-step response.
Yes. Regulate, relate, reason, the 3 R's.
3 R's.
Step 1, regulate, is entirely about safety and sensory reduction. According to the guidelines from the Autism Research Institute, your first job is to secure the physical environment.
Remove dangerous objects.
Dim the harsh overhead lights.
Right.
Turn off the television or the music. If they will accept them, offer noise-canceling headphones.
What about physical contact?
Well, if they find deep pressure regulating, offer a weighted blanket, but be very careful with light touch.
Why is that?
Because light touch can feel like burning to an overloaded nervous system.
Oh, wow. I wouldn't have thought of that. And the sources heavily emphasize that you, the adult, must regulate your own body first. We have to talk about co-regulation here because the biology of this is fascinating.
Co-regulation relies on mirror neurons in the brain. Humans are biologically wired to subconsciously mirror the emotional and physical states of those around them.
Right.
So if you panic, if your breathing becomes shallow and rapid, if you raise your voice or start moving frantically around the room, your mirror neurons are broadcasting a signal of terror.
You are confirming to their brainstem that there really is a life-threatening danger present in the room.
Yes.
You literally infect them with your panic.
You do. You have to become the anchor.
Wow.
You must consciously slow your own breathing, move deliberately and predictably, and stay quiet.
So you want their nervous system to subconsciously latch onto your calm state.
Yes, and borrow it to begin downregulating.
Yeah.
Do not demand eye contact, which is highly stimulating, and do not, under any circumstances, start interrogating them about what is wrong.
Right, because asking questions requires them to access the prefrontal cortex, which we've established is completely offline.
Exactly.
You're demanding they translate a foreign language while their house is on fire. It's just not going to work. So once the physical environment is secured and the physiological arousal begins to slowly dip, we move to step 2, which is relate.
Relate is about profound empathy without judgment. You have to remember that a meltdown is a terrifying experience for the person living it.
They have lost bodily autonomy.
Right. So validating that terror using a low, calm voice to let them know they are safe and that you aren't going anywhere is crucial.
You don't try to fix it, you just bear witness to it and offer a safe presence.
Exactly.
And then finally, we arrive at step 3, which is reason. But the clinical materials put a massive asterisk on this step. This only happens after full recovery.
Yes. You cannot jump to reasoning while the brainstem is still in charge. Recovery takes significant time.
The sources note that the active phase of meltdowns can last anywhere from 20 to 60 minutes or even longer. And the aftermath, the physical toll it takes on the body, is intense.
It's an adrenaline crash.
We are talking about profound, debilitating exhaustion. They might feel intense shame about what they did or said during the storm. And interestingly, they might experience genuine memory loss regarding the meltdown itself.
That memory lapse is a documented trauma response. During a state of hyperarousal, the hippocampus, which encodes memories, can struggle to function properly.
So the brain essentially blacked out during the height of the distress.
Yeah, exactly. Once the brain is fully back online, which might be hours later or even the next day, then you can enter the reason phase.
Right.
You can gently debrief. You collaboratively discuss what the sensory or cognitive triggers might have been, and you brainstorm strategies to avoid that specific overflow in the future.
So what does this all mean? I have an analogy that I think perfectly encapsulates this entire 3Rs process.
Okay, let's hear it.
Trying to reason with someone or discipline them during an autistic meltdown is like trying to teach a drowning person how to swim during a Category 5 hurricane.
That is so accurate.
Right. You do not stand on the deck of a ship and hand them an instructional manual on the biomechanics of the breaststroke. You certainly don't yell at them for getting in the water in the first place. You throw them a life preserver, you hold on to the rope, and you simply wait for the storm to pass.
And if you introduce punishment, scolding, or shame during the regulate phase, you are effectively holding the drowning person underwater.
Wow, yeah.
You will severely exacerbate their trauma, you will prolong the autonomic storm, and you will fundamentally damage the trust in your relationship.
That is the core shift we are trying to achieve today. Tantrums are a bid for control. They are a negotiation, and boundaries are appropriate. Meltdowns are a catastrophic loss of control due to a neurological survival response.
Very well said.
By understanding the biology of sensory overload, the mechanics of the amygdala, and by utilizing the regulate, relate, reason framework, you can shift from being an additional source of stress to becoming a trusted, safe harbor for the neurodivergent people in your life.
And, to build on that idea of being a safe harbor, this raises an important question. There is a concept from the Autism Awareness Center that completely reframes how we view the timing of these storms.
Oh, restraint collapse.
Yes.
Restraint collapse. I saw that in the materials. It is a heavy, incredibly vital concept for families to understand.
It really is. Imagine an autistic individual who has spent their entire day at school or at work successfully masking.
Right. Trying to pass as neurotypical.
Exactly. They have been actively suppressing their sensory distress, forcing eye contact, hiding their natural self-regulating natics, and holding their nervous system together through sheer willpower.
They managed to hold it together all day long.
All day. Then they walk through their front door, drop their backpack, and immediately have a catastrophic explosive meltdown.
And the natural reaction of the parents or the partner is immediate defensiveness. They think, what did we do wrong? Why is our home a trutch? Why are they fine for their teachers but terrible for us?
Right. But it asks you to consider that the meltdown at home might not be triggered by the home environment at all.
The home isn't the trigger. The home is the release valve.
Exactly. It is the result of the individual finally feeling safe enough to drop the mask. The nervous system, which has been stretched to its absolute physiological breaking point for 8 hours, finally recognizes that it is in a secure environment.
And it lets the accumulated overload collapse.
Yes.
So the meltdown isn't a sign that your home is hostile. It's a biological indicator that your home is their ultimate safe space.
They trust you enough to fall apart.
That completely reframes how you view the explosion. It shifts it from a behavioral failure to an act of profound, vulnerable trust. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you carry this deeper neurological empathy forward. The next time you see what looks like an explosion in a public space, or even in your own living room, remember, the outward behavior might look familiar, but biologically speaking, you might just be looking at an autonomic storm on a completely different planet.